Hi everyone, welcome. This is the AWS user group. Anyone in the wrong place? I didn't think so, but look at you. Who is here for the first time? Welcome, welcome, welcome. You obviously registered via the Meetup group, which is great, because that's where the invite is. Keep looking at your inbox, because that's where all of our events are published to. But we do also have the YouTube channel and a Slack channel. All the links are via the website. You search for AWS User Group Perth and you'll find it. And if that's all still too confusing, ask anyone here, because they're all great people. Thank you. Tonight, a long-time friend of the user group, Craig Pickles, is going to talk to us about CodePipeline. How long have you been using this service?
It's been a couple of years, but I do a bit of a deep dive with some bench time last year, so hoping to bring the findings from that to the group. Maybe some discussion.
Some strong opinions on it. So,
strong opinions.
I can't wait for question time. Great.
I'm having some AV problems, so I don't know if the...
Try turning it off and on again.
Yep, always works.
Give it about 5 seconds.
It was working before, so...
Oh, it's coming through.
It's coming through?
It's just too bright. So we've got a blue screen.
Oh, there we go. Is that okay? All right. Thanks for having me. My name is Craig Pickles. I'm a lead consultant at Percent. My background is in development. Spent some time as a solution architect, and I have a bit of a love for CI/CD and exploring different tools out there. So my talk today is CI/CD success using AWS CodePipeline. It's one of those areas where there's a bunch of different tools. There's a ton of different ways of doing things, and it is a little bit opinionated about what the best way of doing things are. CodePipeline itself, as I said, I used it at a client site a couple of years ago, and it was really clear that there was some things that it wasn't quite good at. There's a few shortcomings. But over the last 12 to 18 months, there's been a few features that have come out that have made it on par with the other platforms, and to a point where I think it is something that you should look at if you're looking at doing a CI/CD for workloads. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what CodePipeline is, how it works, some of the reasons why you'd use CodePipeline, digging into things like integration, those features that I was talking about, as well as what does good look like. So I'm going to be opinionated myself and just talk a little bit about how I think you could use this in a project that you're working on with a team doing feature development. I have a live demo, so pray for me. At which point, if there's any questions, please feel free to ask me. And then after the demo, I'm just going to step through a couple of sort of things from the trenches and some real-world problems that I've encountered that I think might be solved by CodePipeline, and a few takeaways. So, without further ado, what is CodePipeline? So, for those who don't know, it's the continuous integration and continuous deployment service that AWS offers, and it's all about building, testing, deploying software. And like any other AWS resource, it is you pay for what you use, you manage it like all your other resources. So, good. Now, how does it work? Now, core construct in our CodePipeline is a stage. Now, in the stage, we have what's called action groups. Now, action groups are groupings of actions. So the actions within these action groups are running in parallel. And then each of these actions can be one of many types. So we've got source, so that's where our source code is coming from. The things that are building and build, the actions we're going to use to test our workload. We have invoke. Invoke's really cool because you can plug that into a Lambda and basically do whatever you want. Deployment, so deploying our workloads to resources in our AWS accounts. We've got manual approvals if we want a manual approval in our pipeline. And there's a new one that came out at the end of last year called Compute, which is basically abstracting away some of the heavy lifting you need to do in a build with code build and just allowing you to put in an asset and a shell script to do something. So it provisions all of the infrastructure behind the scenes and you just tell it what it needs to do. So there's a few things here, and I'll dive into them a bit deeper later on. Now that we've got stage with action groups and actions, then we string stages together. And we can really configure this however we want. It's very flexible. The only real rules is you need at least 2 stages. One stage needs to have a source action in it, and the other stage needs to have at least a build and/or deploy action in it. Now, that was a bit abstract, but if you go into the console, this is what it looks like. You've got your stages with the various action groups, and that's the action group there, and then that's another action group with only one action in it. And you can see your stages and the transitions between it. Now, once you've got that pipeline, you can deploy resources into your account that your pipeline's in, or you can deploy resources into another account or accounts. Now, why would you use CodePipeline? As I said, there's a bunch of different platforms out there. Here's some of the advantages that I think are there for CodePipeline. Security, first and foremost. Now, because you've got your pipeline in an AWS account, it means that you can control who has access to the account, and then what roles they have, and therefore what permissions they can do on that code pipeline. There's also more than that though, because it's in your account, the roles that it uses you can control that fairly tightly. You don't have a role that's been assumed by another platform through an access key and a secret key, so that's not out there. And you don't have a God role, so something that can do a whole bunch of things. You can really start to bring it down to a sort of a least privilege model. Integration, there are an absolute ton of integrations, both to AWS services, but to a small number of third-party tools as well at each stage or each action provider. And I've got some more slides digging into that. Features. Now, because you're putting actions and stages and really customizing, it is highly flexible, highly customizable, and there's some cool, interesting features, well, I think they're cool anyway, that have started to add quality of life features and to make it a little bit more comparable to other platforms, a little bit more what you'd expect from a CI/CD tool. Something that I'm also probably quite late to the party on is CDK and pipelines as code. Now, because it is AWS resources, I can use CDK and I can use things like constructs in CDK to start to extract out things to make me building those pipelines easier, and for the next person that comes along to also be able to do that without as much engineering effort. For those who know CDK, you can also add unit tests on it, which is good. It's a massive one-up on anything that's using YAML. Spent a lot of time in YAML and starting to really hate it. So pipeline as code is just really good in my opinion. Also, because we're in AWS, we've got native integration to CloudWatch. We can put X-Ray in as well, so we start to get all the logging, the visualization. You can put that into other AWS services and you can start to instrument your pipelines and get a really good picture of what's going on in your pipeline. Now, enterprise requirements, it's a little bit vague, but there might be some things going on in your organization that makes it really hard for you to procure the tools that you might need to do this. Or once you've got them, there might be a need to have a team that looks after it, and that team might then need to be engaged to do something for you, and that might all take time. But if you're able to spin up a pipeline and control everything that you need for that pipeline, then that becomes really powerful. So on the topic of security, I'll just throw in this slide here to talk about the managed policies that come up for CodePipeline. So if I have a developer role, for example, to access my account, my developer role has a managed policy, potentially read-only, but maybe I have full access. So you get these managed policies out of the box to really help control that. And if any new permissions come into these managed policies, AWS takes care of that for you. Now, cost breakdown, just take this one with a grain of salt. There's a lot on here. It's going to be highly variable, but what I wanted to do here is show the types of things that you would look at when comparing CodePipeline to another platform. Now, I base these on 25 users, roughly 50 executions with a 15-minute duration, so 22,500 minutes, about 200 gigs of storage, 100 gigs of logs, and about 1 million sort of CloudWatch events going on behind the scenes. In US dollars, no discounts applied. So at the top, licensing. So while CodePipeline doesn't have any licensing costs per se, you're definitely going to have them in another platform. Now, note this down the bottom here, we're still going to need a Git repository because code commit has been sunsetted. So you may need some costs, you may need to have licensing costs for a Git repository, you may not, depending on what you're doing. So it's $0 for CodePipeline. Compute, much of a muchness. So I've put in hosted runners and self-hosted runners. So hosted runners are the platform is running them, self-hosted is we're running, say, an EC2 instance or code build in our AWS account. Comparing that to a cost and code build, and these are the smallest instance types you can have. Storage is much of a muchness, $50 versus $54. The biggest differences of monitoring, alerting, and events and integration is that those are all included in your licensing when you're doing another platform, but then we start to get CloudWatch costs, EventBridge, Lambda, those sorts of things are going on behind the scenes. Similarly with data transfer, the only real difference is if you've got a self-hosted runner, you've got to get your code or your package from the other platform into AWS, so that download may take some extra time. So you will have additional runner time. How much that is, it's really going to depend on what you're running, but something large could actually blow out the time substantially. And totals down the bottom. If you take away the licensing, it's cheaper to run on the alternative platform from a sort of compute and from a other resource perspective. But it's not really comparing apples and apples, it's more of an apples and oranges comparison because of that licensing component. So a Git repository still needs to live somewhere, and that's still going to have a cost associated with it, most likely. Final point is no discounts applied. So I know a lot of customers with AWS will have agreements in place that do get you some discounts in the order of 20 or 30%, and that's something that can bring down your AWS costs as well. You might also get a similar level of discount on the alternative platform, but it's all going to depend. So that's my cost breakdown. And the takeaway is for this is it really depends. There's no clear cost benefit to going one or the other, but things that you need to be concerned about. Now, integration. So we've got all that different types of actions. I haven't included approvals or the compute on this. I really want to show all the different types of things that you can do at each of these stages. So in source, we've got ECR and S3. So if an image is put into ECR, we can trigger a pipeline. Code going into an S3 bucket can trigger it. And code commit can be used as a trigger for your pipeline. More on code commit in a bit. But then we've got the three sort of big players down here. And they can be set up using what's called a code star connection. Sets up a link between your Git repository and your pipeline that enables changes in the Git repository to trigger off your pipeline. They're the cloud versions, but GitHub and GitLab also support enterprise and self-hosted as well. Build, so we can do an image build. We can use code build to basically run anything we want. And we can farm out our builds to Jenkins if you've got a Jenkins server. Similarly with test, device farm for devices, for for mobile devices and whatnot. Code build again, and then Jenkins again, but also a few third-party providers for your test suites. I don't really know too much about RunScope, Ghost Inspector, and Micro Focus, but they have native integration. Invoke, it's Lambda. So anything Lambda can do, your pipeline can do. And deploy, and this is where it gets really interesting because all of these services present various features for deployment. Now, your CodePipeline can then use those features as part of your deployment. So CodeDeploy, for example, with blue-green deployments, can be plugged directly into your pipeline. Similarly, CloudFormation, we can deploy a stack. So there's a lot going on here and a lot of different options. And if you jump into, not quite yet, why would you use code commit anyway? And this is a comment from a colleague of mine, and I think I've sufficiently blurted out now, Steve, that you can't tell who it is.
It's not me. It's not me.
It's not you. I had a conversation with a colleague in March last year, because this is when this whole journey started. And he said to me, "Why would you use code commit anyway?" And it's almost like AWS heard him say that, because next minute, code commit disappeared. So as of July last year, you can't create any more code commit repositories.
For new users.
For new users, existing users?
Already used code commit.
Ooh, that's interesting.
And top hack for young players, if you vend an account into an organisation, an AWS organisation that does support code commit, and then you detach the account from the organisation, it still has access to code commit.
Wow, I didn't know that. Cool.
We're brokering them at $10 an account.
Yeah.
However, if you if you go and try and create a new pipeline through the console, like I was demoing this to somebody the other day, you cannot select a code commit repository.
Oh.
So
They've got you.
Right. And there's still the question of why would you use code commit anyway?
Yeah.
So
Well,
we need to get that answer.
There are arguments, but
so to answer that is, it was really nice having everything in AWS. It made it really easy, and you didn't have to talk about another platform or another Git repository at all. But if you were comparing it to the features that another provider gives you, it was pretty bare bones, yeah.
It's no good for developer experience, but if you're using something like Landing Zone Accelerator, which is a massive engine for creating and maintaining an organisational infrastructure in AWS, it was designed to be hosted in code commit, deployed with CodePipeline, and so everything was within one account.
That actually relies on S3 now.
Instead of,
yeah.
You guys know more than I do. All good. All right, so maybe. All right, so all those options were native to CodePipeline, easy to configure. So I whacked up a few examples of CDK here and just how easy it is to configure some of these things. So I've got my code build project, and that's the action. So it's 5 lines or a few more lines, but it's quite succinct. And if you compare this to what you have to do in CloudFormation with YAML, the YAML was much longer. And your CloudFormation stack off to the side, really simple to set up. I've been really impressed just how easy it was, having written this whole thing in CloudFormation to begin with, and then porting it across to CDK. I was like, oh, I should have just done this in the first place. But this is what it looks like. It's going to be more complicated depending on how complicated your workloads get, but in its simplest form, this is what you're looking at. Now, I talked a bit about features. So this is really where my journey started. I saw, I think it was March last year, something about triggers. I thought, the fixed code commit, I can now use branches and tags and all those different things to trigger my pipelines. It turns out it's only for the CodeStar connection, so GitLab, GitHub, Bitbucket. But you can do some really cool things. So now you can trigger your pipeline based on pull request events. so when they're created and updated. You can look at particular branches. So we can be looking at main, but we can also be looking at your typical feature / style branches or a fix. And we can trigger now from a tag. So if you want to do a release tag, that can be the trigger for your pipeline executing. And then we can also filter by specific values of patterns for files, paths, and for folders. So think about a big mono repo with a whole bunch of modules. So now you can target modules specifically and potentially just be deploying part of your mono repo with multiple pipelines dealing with different aspects of that. So it's quite powerful what you can now do with this. And it starts to cater more for the developer workflows that we're probably more suited to working to. Next, and this was a pipeline V2 feature, was execution modes. It used to be everything sort of stacked up behind each other and it was really difficult to see what was going on. And they introduced the idea of a queued execution where things are moving behind each other. Parallel execution, so multiple executions happening at the same time. We've got variables, so we can have environment variables or whatever variables we want that can be done with each execution. I've gone straight to prod there, so you can potentially override defaults in your pipeline or be catering for whatever thing you need to do. Something that dropped probably really recently in the last couple of weeks or months is they finally fixed the view. So I go in here and I can see a new view that is a little bit more like I would see if I was going and looking at one of the other platforms. I can see what it's doing, I can see where it's up to, it's nice and visual, and I was quite excited about this, to be honest. Manual approvals. So lots of customers don't want you to go straight to prod. They'll probably want some sort of checks and balances in your pipeline. So that's where approvals come in. You approve or reject before you go into a particular environment. And that managed policy I showed you with approval permissions, that's where you would give that policy to someone and only approved users can come in and approve a deployment to prod. We've also got stage configuration, automatic rollbacks and retries when your stage fails. The rollback rolls back to the last good execution and retry will retry a number of times. And then we move on to conditions. So some recent things around conditions, I think this was again last year towards the end. They introduced the idea of being able to, on entry, be able to skip or fail your stage based on some criteria. On success, rollback and failure, you can do things on that. And then you can add a failure condition as well. So what do you do when this stage fails? What do you do when your deployment fails? What do you need to clean up over and above the things that you've done? So maybe you have to roll back some database scripts or something along those lines. So you can start to cater for those workflows. And hot off the press, at 4 days, this list here went from 4 to having also code build and commands in there. So you can run a code build project and you can run those commands. So you can be running shell scripts as well. So this is really powerful and allows you to do a lot of different things with your workflows that you couldn't do before. The entry condition was interesting to me because immediately I thought about feature toggling. How cool would it be if I could feature toggle my pipeline? So if I'm introducing a whole nother part of my workflow, but I'm not quite ready to turn it on yet, but I want to know that my workflow or my pipeline deploys, I can now do that and we can toggle on that stage when we want to. Now, I tried to get that working. I didn't get very far with it. Would have loved to have demoed that today. Now, I'm going to get opinionated a little bit here. What does good look like? This is my version of what good looks like, but it's going to be heavily dependent on the thing that you're building and how your teams like to work. So I've made some statements here. Now, because code commit's gone away, I'm suggesting that we're probably going to be using a GitHub, a GitLab, or a Bitbucket because they are very sort of feature rich and a lot of people can use them. They are used to using them, have used them before. Now, we want to support common developer workflows. For me, that's working on feature branches, it's raising PRs, it's reviewing and then merging back into a main line. You might be tagging and releasing off that as well, but I've gone with feature branches in a main line. And then we actually want to do continuous delivery like we would at a client site. So we want it to be repeatable, we want it to be end-to-end. We probably don't want to go straight to prod, so we want some gates in there that allow us to control maybe a change request, maybe it's just someone giving you the thumbs up before you do that production deployment. And when I looked at this, I immediately thought about, well, what if I need to do the next pipeline? How do I make this so that my job doing that next one is easier? Or the next person, if I have to do this 100 times, how can I do it in the most efficient way, reducing the overall engineering effort? Now, how might we do this? So I suggest we have a continuous integration pipeline. So when a pull request is created, it starts a parallel execution in a continuous integration pipeline. So that parallel execution mode allows us to now do that. And then a continuous delivery pipeline, which when you merge into main, deploys to a dev, we have a manual approval, and then we deploy to production. And that's where that queued execution comes in. So we want things to proceed in an orderly manner. Now, we want to create these pipelines with reuse in mind for teams and projects. And then how do we integrate it back to our Git repository? What options do we have so that we don't have two things out by themselves? There is integration between it. So we know what builds have been done and we know what deployments have been successful on both sides. So continuous integration. So I've gone with GitHub, and don't judge me on that, but it could be GitLab, it could be Bitbucket. And then that allows us to use these triggers. So when we create an update, a PR, with one of these branch filters, feature /*, that's the trigger for our pipeline. What does this do? Runs code build. Code build is building our workload, it's running unit tests, and doing some linting. This gets a lot more complicated depending on what you're doing, but in the simplest sort of application, my application that I tested on is doing an event bridge rule, triggering a Lambda that says hello world, so it's really simple. This is what you do. You just have to build it and you have to package it up so then you can deploy it. And then once we're ready for deployment, we use a code build again to do the deploy, and that deploys to a CloudFormation stack. Now, I know that there's a CloudFormation provider that could do this for you, but what using code build allows me to do in this instance is it allows me to create a separate stack for this PR. So it's got a PR annotation or branch suffix on it. So I end up with a separate stack that I can test in isolation, and I'm not treading on other people's toes in dev. And when you look at this in CodePipeline, it sort of looks like this. Now that new view means that I can see exactly what it's doing. Source, build, deploy, code build, GitHub. Now moving on to back to continuous integration. Event Bridge and Lambda. So exploring that Git integration was really interesting because we can plug into the events happening within our pipeline. I'm going to trigger a Lambda. And in this case, my Lambda is doing a couple of different things. It's adding comments saying when the execution has happened. It's putting in checks and updating it, whether it's succeeded or failed, whether it's pending, so we know what's happening from the repository side. We can approve or reject a PR. This one's dangerous, but it's possible. And deployments, so creating and updating the status of a deployment. So in this case, dev. So we know that it's happening, we know that it's failed or that it's succeeded. Put a couple of asterisks next to checks and deployments because these are the ones you're probably going to be targeting. The comments and approvals, depending on what you're doing, may or may not be beneficial. So moving on to continuous delivery. So this one's easy with its triggers, main. So once we've merged our PR into main, that's the trigger for our pipeline. I'm going to repeat our build again. So exactly the same build steps. Now we're using the CloudFormation action provider to deploy to a named dev stack. Now, you probably want to add some extra tests in here to make sure dev's working. integration tests or smoke tests. I haven't done that, but this is where you'd add them in, and you could even use those conditions at the end, or additional things like invoking a Lambda, whatever really you want to figure out that you're ready to then deploy to production. Now you've got the approval, that's the manual approval, and once you get your manual approval, you're basically essentially just repeating the prod deploy. So stack, but it's now a prod stack in your target prod account. And then bringing it back to that picture of the pipeline view, source build, deploy dev with approval, and deploy to prod. Now, everyone loves a good architecture diagram, so how does all this hang together? So this is it, and I'm going to talk through various aspects of it. First is that I've got multiple accounts here. So we've got non-prod and we've got production accounts. But I've also put in a tools account because I want my pipeline to be separate from my workload accounts, and I want it to be in the one place, so it's deploying to many accounts. Now this pattern may be different. I know some places like to have accounts per product team. So you get a non-prod account and a prod account, and then every team for every product gets one of those. And then there's other places that will have a centralized tools account or a centralized platform that is deploying to all their accounts and many workloads to all of those accounts. So this could vary a bit, but I think at least you're looking at a separate account for that pipeline. Now within that account, your pipelines are going to use things like KMS keys. They're going to have an S3 bucket for artifacts, and you might have an S3 topic that's targeting an email, address, or Slack, or whatever else you get your notifications through. You don't necessarily want to repeat that for all of your pipelines. You might just want to create it once. KMS keys are going to have a cost associated with them. So if you have 100 pipelines with 100 KMS keys, you're going to pay for 100 keys. So some common resources there. When we're deploying cross-account, we're going to have cross-account roles. So our pipeline is assuming those cross-account roles to be able to do what it needs to do. And then we're going to have separate stacks provision for our pipeline. So there's a few stacks going on here. And within your pipeline, you have your code pipeline, you have the code build projects that are associated with it. You might have the Event Bridge and Lambda integrations in there, but you might not. It just depends. Now, cross-account roles, I deploy them as stack sets, and this is something I've done with clients before, is if you've got one centralized place you're deploying your pipeline from, and you want to be able to deploy to 4, 8, 12, however many accounts you have, you need to be able to deploy these in a repeatable manner. Stack sets are a great way of deploying to all those accounts and making sure all those accounts, or even an organizational unit, has the roles that it needs. And then you can establish a relationship between the service roles for CodePipeline and those roles, and then the resources that it needs. So you're starting to introduce that least privilege. You can only access what you need to access, which is really good. Now, out of that, there's a few recommendations. Now, first is the accounts. Based on your teams and your usage patterns, to think about how you'll structure those accounts. What is the best fit for your environment? And then you want to consider how those cross-account roles are managed. So how do you roll out that cross-account role that you need, or cross-account roles that you need, in an easy way? Control tower customizations is good, stack sets is good. You might have some additional automations that you can use to do that. Design those stacks. So you want to consider the reuse. What are the common resources and resources you don't necessarily want to deploy for every pipeline? There's a design piece that comes into that, and it's not really dissimilar from what we would do if we were building a workload on AWS. Use CDK. Just makes this so much easier. If you're going to use CodePipeline, use CDK, and then start to create custom constructs that allow you to reuse things. Similarly, there's a great amount of constructs in the construct libraries out there, like third-party and AWS managed, that make some of these things a lot easier as well. And then you want to think about, what are the requirements for your Git repositories? What do you want to be able to see when this code pipeline runs? from your Git repository, and how do you connect the two together? So that's going to be different for every team, but it's definitely something that you need to think about when you go down this path. Now, the demo. Any questions there? Any burning questions before I launch into the demo that I can have a stab at answering? Silence is good.
Any considerations or gotchas that you can think of when prepping for cross-account, cross-region deployments with a single pipeline?
No,
Buckets, etc.
no gotchas specifically. It's just it can be finicky getting them right. That's for sure.
Yep.
But once you've got them right for one, then I think it's the age-old thing. Is like if you restrict it down to least privilege and you only need you've only given it what you need, so those roles can only do a certain amount of things, you can almost guarantee that the next person that comes along will need to do something different. So you're always going to be in that sort of constant cycle of updating your cross-account roles to do the thing that your next workload can do. So that's potentially a gotcha, but speaking from experience a little bit there, that's definitely something to be aware of.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you use build systems like GitLab and GitHub, you'd have a runner that you use for certain particular tasks that you want, or you might have to have a Docker container that you create to run certain things. So inside this environment, is there a concept like that? Would you use the Lambda invoke to do those kind of things, or?
Code build, like there's a bunch of resources that you can run within inside your VPC. So you effectively, code build is one. You could do Lambda with VPC if you need, that's all you need from VPC integration, but there's nothing stopping you from using something like code deploy to spin up a container as well. Be able to do, I assume it's like something like integration testing.
Well, no, it's more like the issues we had were, and I suppose if you're already in AWS, it doesn't matter, but the issues we had was we had to create runners that could access AWS and push stuff to AWS because the standard GitLab runner couldn't do that. And so that, that's what I'm saying. Can you create a runner that might have some bizarre thing that you need to do your build?
Actually got some slides after the demo on some of those scenarios, but it just makes it a whole lot easier because you're already within your accounts.
Yep.
And if you've got a VPC and it's peered to another VPC, to your tools account, then all those sort of barriers fall away. And now you're effectively just running an AWS resource to do what you need to do. And that could be an EC2, ECS, Lambda, could be any of those things. So I think that caters for it.
Yeah.
But it's going to really come down to what is it you're trying to do. Yeah. So no self-hosted runners is basically where we're at with this. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Regarding that manual approval step, is that manageable via API access as well? Like the use case I'm thinking about here is kind of, for doing manual approvals via like a Slack account, for example, right? Rather than having to have possibly non-technical people going into AWS console and so on and kind of going through for those workflows.
I'm going to say yes, but because I assume you can call the CLI and you can do approvals. But I don't know for sure. Slack is one, but I didn't talk about ITSM integration and all, but the other one is like the automatic creation of change requests and then the automatic approval of those steps. Once the change request is approved, that's, I think, a really good use case. I don't know whether that comes out of the box, but I can have a look afterwards.
Cool.
Yep. Yes?
It's more related to CI/CD than AWS itself. So like we have a hub and spoke model in which you have the technology in the center and then you have the departments, the developers within the respective departments. So if they were to do a minor change and then send it to us for approval and then we deploy, that's what we're doing right now. is it practical or is it advised to give all that to them? I mean,
So-
we just had the final approval thing probably through API or whatever, but
So for me, that comes down to trust. Yeah. Who do you trust to build your pipelines? And then who do you trust to tick or hit approve on that approval? And it doesn't really matter whether you're using CodePipeline or using GitLab or Jenkins. Like, it's a very sort of organizational thing.
have you seen this kind of a requirement or?
Yes.
Most
Yeah.
people's behavior or?
So I've seen teams where you're in control of building the pipelines and being able to hit the button on the deployment, and it's very casual, but it's a bit more relaxed than some other places where I've seen where only certain people can do the prod deployment, and only certain people can build the pipelines that you're using to then do the deployment. So from a developer perspective, I'll do this. Yep, I'll do the prod deployment. You can trust me. Yeah, but not everyone thinks like me. Yeah, I did spend some time in on a project where once you merged to main, it actually went straight to production, and was fully feature toggled. So you'd put feature toggles in launch darkly, and it would go straight to prod, and then you'd toggle it on, you make sure it works, and then you toggle on for everyone. And that was absolutely awesome. Loved that. But see, there's a whole mix of ways of doing it. Does anyone else have sort of perspectives to share on that? Because I know it's different everywhere. Darren?
I think it's not a code pipeline thing, is it?
No, it's not. No.
It's more of a DevOps thing.
It's a DevOps thing.
Branching strategies and all those kind of things that will, come
It's a
into
cascading
this.
exercise.
Yep, certainly is. I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but
That's okay.
yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
All right, so jumping out of the Prezzo, CodePipeline. So we've got our two pipelines here, CI pipeline and a CD pipeline. So I jump into my CI pipeline. You can see that it's got lots of executions. And just scrolling down the list, I've done a lot of different things in here and tried out many different things. So you can see all my pull requests, my feature branches that I've used to do these things, and some successes and failures in there. And if you drill into your execution ID, now we get the pipeline view, source build and dev deploy. And from here, we can have a look at what did our code build do. So this will take us to a code build view, shows us all the logs, and if we wanted to go and view the entire log, then this takes us through to CloudWatch. So that's that observability piece coming in there. Similarly, we've got our code build project for, we'll jump back from here, it's taking this code build. For dev deploy, so we'll see much the same there. And if we jump into this link here, this takes us through to, or should do, our GitHub repository. So this shows us the commit that went in. And if we click here, it now shows us the pull request that's associated with that. And if anyone's got any specific, I guess, GitHub questions, this might not be familiar to everyone, but it's sort of part of what I've done here. I'm happy to answer any questions on this. So just looking at this PR here, it's approved. I've got my comments on here for execution, started, succeeded. I've got the checks that were performed as part of this, the checks, so continuous integration, and I can see that it was successfully deployed as well. So I'm going to go ahead and merge this pull request. And then we can see what's happening with our continuous deployment or delivery pipeline. Now, before we do that, if I jump into code, I'm going to create another pull request to show the continuous integration pipeline actually working. So pull request, new pull request. I'm going to merge in branch for new PR. There we go. It's thinking ahead. I'm going to create a pull request. I'm going to get a bit, yeah, so that's that. So if I go back to CodePipeline now, I should see two things. Create my pull request. So one, I'll go into my continuous delivery pipeline. It's actually kicked off that deployment, or that pipeline. So it's building at the moment. It's going to deploy to dev, we're going to require approval, and then it's going to deploy to prod, so we'll step through all that. Now, while that's happening, I'll step back into my PR here. So we've got a comment saying our execution has started, pending deployment, we've got our check is in progress, we've got some conflicts that need to be resolved. So I'm just going to quickly go and resolve those. Mark as resolved, and I can commit the merge. So while we're waiting for the CD pipeline to go, now we can see that our CI pipeline is in progress. There's two. Now, this is because I've just immediately done a pull request and I've done another commit. This is, I guess, one of the shortcomings is that it's going to start to try and build and deploy both of these things. There's an opportunity here to add a few extra sort of guardrails in, perhaps through entry conditions, cancelling previous executions that would start to make this a little less flaky. Imagine if we're all merging in and there's lots of pull requests, this could start to get quite busy. What I expect to happen here is that one's going to fail because it's going to be trying to deploy a stack, or both of them just go through because they are sort of the timing has been that way. So source, build, and dev deploy again. I'm just going to jump back into GitHub again because I had a PR with fail checks here. So this is the other side of things, is when it fails to build, we get a rejected PR, we can see that it was failed, and then you can start to see our check here has actually failed, and you can drill through to CodePipeline. So there's that bi-directional integration between the two, and then fail build, and then I can click on here and I can see what it's doing. So there's a lot to be said for investing some time in this integration, because that catering for that developer experience will mean the success of using CodePipeline, or its failure, as people will go, I don't want to use this because I have to be in two things. So it almost becomes seamless. Now hopefully my CD pipeline has gone through dev. It has. So just quickly, I've got my non-prod account over here. And if I update this, I've got a create in progress for my new PR. You can also see a named stack over here for the branch that we merged in. Another opportunity is to clean up these old stacks if we're creating multiple dev stacks. We don't want these hanging around. There's multiple ways that you can do that, but I didn't explore that too much. And then we've got our named dev stack here. And then prod, jumping across into prod. We've got a prod named stack here, but it's not deploying yet. If we go into our approval, and we hit approve on this, and submit, and immediately we start to deploy to production. Or when it thinks about it, it'll start to deploy to production. And hopefully, and this probably will take a minute or two, straight away, updating our CloudFormation stack. So that's the pipelines working end to end. Is there anything anyone else wants to see on this? I've sort of breezed through it, glossed over a few things perhaps. Good? Any questions on that?
Want to show us your code and project structure?
Code and project structure? I have a slide for you. I have a public GitHub repo with a QR code at the end.
Excellent.
That you can go and see the templates and the code for this. Totally unreviewed. All right, so I'll go jump back into the Prezzo. Now, going back to, I guess, your questions about some problems that you might get having a platform outside and having to use external runners. or self-hosted runners, there's a few things I noticed on recent projects that were hard because of that. I don't think they're the same. I want to just touch on those. First one, though, I've updated my pipeline and now everything is broken, sad face. One of the big problems I see with YAML is that it looks correct, but then you go to deploy it and it all falls in a giant heap. So having code that you can run it separately, you can then put unit tests on it, I think is incredibly powerful and means I don't have to write YAML. But pipelines don't have access to VPC-bound resources like RDS or OpenSearch. Comes back to, I need to be in AWS to do this thing that I need to do. And then sort of related to that is integration tests. So if I have to do SSO, I have to be part of a trusted network. I can't do that if I'm running outside of it, if I'm running in a sort of an unconnected space. So how does this sort of work? Or how can CodePipeline help? RDS and OpenSearch, the public internet can't hit your private resources. But as soon as you've got a tools account with a VPC running code build in your VPC, and we've peered it together through a network connection, so VPC peering, maybe transit gateway if that's what you've got in your AWS environment, we now have a connection between the two. I can call resources in the other account. Now, the other one is the trusted network. So I can go out to SSO, but I fail because I'm not technically part of that network. But through network connections, direct connect, transit gateway again, we can be an extension of our on-premises network. We are part of that network now, and therefore we are trusted to be able to do that authentication. Now, this was going to be the solution for a managed service team that was taking over from a project that I was working on, and they were going to use code build. Now, you notice CodePipeline's not up here because you just need the code build element of it to do it. You need something that can run in a VPC. So this is perhaps something where you don't need CodePipeline, but it makes it easier. You could then take this away and you could use it, code build in your other platform to accomplish the same thing, as long as you've got that networking in place and you've got code build in the right location. Now, I'm going to end with some takeaways. And is CodePipeline the right fit? And because it's AWS, I have to say it depends. It's contrasting the service to what it was a couple of years ago. It's more mature. It's got a bunch of features. It's really flexible and lots of integration options that I think now do make it a viable candidate if you were to be building your CI/CD pipelines. With a bit of upfront design, bit of thought, using CDK and reusable constructs, we can start to look at how we'll scale this out to our teams, reduce engineering effort, and there is a bit of a learning curve to this sort of stuff. We can reduce that learning curve for people who are coming in as well. Now, separation of the code repository from the pipeline itself might be a deal breaker for some people. Some people might want to be all in the same space. But you can mitigate those things by having that integration in place, the integration that you identify as being valuable for your team. So I think if you nail that, then there's nothing stopping you from going down this path.